So I'm going to read this scripture passage to you all, and it's coming from the Message version. It's one of my favorite versions of the Bible. And it's from the book of Ephesians. Some people say that Paul, the Apostle Paul, wrote this, and then a lot of folks say, well, that's just a pseudonym and we don't know who. So I'm just going to say Paul for just general sake. So here's what Paul writes to the church. It's the early church. They're in the midst of conflict. There are all sorts of differences. There's Jews, there's Gentiles. There's different ethnic backgrounds. They don't get along. They're coming into this community from all their differences. And then he says, watch what God does, and then you do it, like children who learn proper behavior from their parents. Mostly what God does is love you. Keep company with God and learn a life of love. Observe how Jesus loved, not cautiously, but extravagantly. Love like that. Let thanksgiving be our dialect. Wake up from your sleep. Climb out of your coffins. Love will show you the light. Watch your step. Use your head. Make the most of every chance you get. These are desperate times. Don't live carelessly, unthinkingly. Make sure you understand what God wants. So we're in this series of a spirituality of falling, the blessings of an imperfect life. And last week was kind of interesting. I got a lot of interesting feedback from folks with regard to some of the message. It was a struggling kind of message, I think, for a lot of folks to hear this idea of what it means to sort of, I think I ended it with that Zen fable or Zen story and said, instead of trying to taste the strawberry when you're hanging from that vine and being present to what is there, I think I said that sometimes we just need to ask for more tigers. And I heard several people emailed me afterwards and said, what are you saying? We're in the midst of a conflict, so we need to ask for more conflict. We need to love the things that frighten us. Well, I'm going to go into that a little more this morning, just a little more as we kind of move forward with this idea of what it means to fall freely. And to kind of get us there, I need to tell you a little story, because I always like to open up with this story about some of the things that occurred to me that brought some insight to this. And one of them, of course, is my uncle. My uncle, who's always playing with my mind, even now that he's been dead for 2 years, he's still playing with my head. And so I'm remembering a time when we went hiking. We were in the Guadalupe Mountains, and we were about 300 feet above the sea level, about 5,000 or so feet above the surface, above the highway down below. If you've been to the Guadalupe Mountains, you know they're out near El Paso on the road out west. They're south of New Mexico. And we were climbing. Now, my uncle, of course, this was a last-minute thing like he sometimes would do. He was unencumbered by relationships other than those that he would just conscribe at the moment. So it's spring break, and he says, what are you doing? And I said, nothing. He says, let's go hiking. And then 8 hours later, we're out at Guadalupe Mountains. So all day long the next day we climb up. It takes almost all day, and he's over-prepared because you never know what's going to happen, and he subscribes to the Boy Scout model, always be prepared. So we're both carrying packs with 60 pounds of weight in them. I mean, we're prepared for anything. We have like 4 options for every meal, and we have multiple types of clothing in case it's cold, it's rainy, whatever. We have 2 tents in case we don't like the first one we put up. So we are completely encumbered by weight. And we get up towards the top, and I go over the crest, and I'm about 15 yards ahead of him, and I'm moving down the trail on the other side because I'm kind of excited. I've already jumped ahead of him. And then I hear this loud, blood-curdling scream. And I look back, and there's no Uncle Mac. And I run to the top of the trail. I drop my pack, run to the top of the trail, look over the side, and there's Uncle Mac about 40 feet down the hillside, right up against a cliff, literally a cliff. He's sitting on a big boulder, like a big rock, with his backpack. And he's just sitting there smiling at me. And I look at him and I said, what happened? And he said, well, my pack fell down the hill and almost fell 500 feet off the edge of this cliff. And I said, why the blood-curdling scream? And he said, because I was wearing it at the time. But we both walked and we looked, and sure enough, it was a steep fall. And he smiled and he said, the truth is, if I weren't wearing this pack, I might have gone ahead and gone off the edge. Maybe the pack caused the fall. Sometimes we fall, and it's sort of a calculated risk we take. Like if you're climbing, you kind of realize you're going to fall. It's a chance you take. You don't figure you'll fall off something. You'll stay close to the surface, and you'll have a little bit of an anchor. Sometimes we fall in calculated risks because we didn't plan out every single detail. My uncle and I sometimes would go tree trimming, and I laughed once when he was trimming a branch and happened to be sitting on the branch he was cutting. And he was just lucky that there was a ladder about 3 feet away that he could grab before falling 10 or 15 feet to the ground. Sometimes we assume we're taking some calculated risks. You know, if I'm putting shingles on the top of the roof, I figure I'll stay close to the roof edge and I'll be all right. But sometimes we take calculated risks that we allow other people to calculate for us. Like when you're taking a ride at Six Flags. And you're looking at this big Texas shootout, and, you know, it's doing all these great, big, deep, steep things, and you're going like, I'm not going to ride that thing. But then you get a little courage, and you go, well, you know, they probably did a good job building the thing. And then you notice other people getting off the ride going like, they survived, they did okay. And you do it for the thrill, maybe, for the exhilaration. Sometimes you might do something like I did. Somebody talked me into it, my wife, and I guess it was my wife, and it may have been the kids were there. I couldn't remember. We were in Belize, and I was parasailing 600 feet above the water. And they said, no problem. We do this all the time. But I don't do this all the time. Sometimes you take calculated risks that are even greater risks, but you assume people know what they're doing. Like Laura Simmons, Lori Simmons. I can't imagine what she does. You've done it 3 times now? Twice now? Skydiving.
Oh, twice.
Twice. Jumping from a plane, thousands of feet up. Attached to somebody. You're thinking, they know what they're doing. But we take these calculated risks, and sometimes we think about what might happen when the unexpected occurs, and it keeps us from taking these risks. I think there's ways in which we fall that we don't plan. And there are simple kinds of things, but they catch us so off guard that we feel like we're free-falling. An emotional free fall, perhaps. I was talking to a friend of mine, actually a friend of Brad's in mine. Where's Brad? Ah, there you are, right there. Yeah, Brad and I used to work with this guy all the time. He lives out in California, and we both heard recently of this news. He had been diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's 4th stage cancer. And it just took us by complete surprise. He's already in the midst of chemotherapy. But what was most surprising, I think, for Brad and I, now his name is Mickle the Pickle. And so you're thinking, well, that's kind of surprising in itself. I mean, working with a guy who calls himself the Pickle. But if you really know who he is, he's like a clown of God. You know, his background is Jewish, and he would say to us that he wasn't a good Jew. He would actually say that. I'm not a good Jew. And I'd laugh, and I'd say, look at what you're doing. Because he spent the last 25 years working with kids with chronic illness, traveling all over the country, and oftentimes not being paid a whole lot for it. And the irony, of course, is as we're watching and reading this, that he'd been now diagnosed with cancer, is the fact that he'd worked for so many years with kids who had cancer. It seems unfair. It seems ironic. It seems tragic, even. And so I emailed him, and he was talking to me. He emailed back, and he said, when I got the diagnosis, it was kind of almost ironic humor. And then he said, I realized that I was in a free fall. After the diagnosis, it just suddenly hit me how mysterious and frightening this is. He says, I got lots of friends around, but sometimes I feel like I'm falling endlessly, like I'm just in a free fall. I think we might know what that's like. I mean, the fact is that everyday things can overwhelm us, and we sometimes find ourselves in a free fall. And if you've had a pattern of history, maybe that you tend to make a lot of mistakes. And now you're not making so many mistakes, but you can't let go of that reality of your past, all those mistakes you have made. You fall in and out of relationships, in and out of love. We fall on our face sometimes, and then we wonder how we're ever going to get and live that down. We stand in front of people in different contexts, and we always put ourselves on the line vulnerably, and sometimes we fall. It's hard to get back up. Everyday life in itself can sometimes overwhelm us to that place where we sometimes feel like we are falling endlessly, like in a free fall. And Richard Rohr has this great phrase that he uses in this book. I told you we've been reading this book, and Lynn Deloney's going to do some exercises and work with it after this series, if anybody's interested in that. It's a book called Falling Upward, the spirituality for the second half of life. But he uses this phrase in there that's called falling freely. And it struck me as an interesting phrase given the way we think about life when it overwhelms us. We don't want to fall. We don't like falling out of control. When you think of free falling, you think of spinning out of control. You think of simply nothing there to stop you. It's a frightening prospect. And he somehow says, no, it's a way towards a deeper spirituality. So I looked it up. I looked up free fall. And you know what free fall means, right? Spinning out of control? No, it actually doesn't. We use it incorrectly most of the time. Aerodynamically speaking, it actually means falling in your ideal relationship. It means an object that falls in its ideal state in relationship to the gravity around it, or that's attracting it. So, for example, in the earth, it would be an object falling without any encumbrance, without anything moving it, without a backpack on its back, without wind to drop its fall. It literally is falling in its ideal state. There's really nothing like that unless you have a vacuum or unless you look at the moon. Because the moon is in free fall. Strange, right? The moon is in its ideal relationship with nothing else affecting it other than its relationship to the earth. That's what I think Paul is talking about in the book in this chapter of Ephesians. Now, it's my metaphor. It's not his metaphor. But I think what he's saying here is, when you look back at the text, I think what he's saying here is that when we are in right relationship, we are out of our coffins. We are living in the midst of life. We are living in the midst of light. How do you get out of the muck? That's not where we're supposed to be. How do you get out of the darkness? That's not where we're supposed to be. How do we live with the suffering? That's not where we're supposed to be. How do we get in ideal relationship? Or what I would call our ideal state with God. I had this professor of theology at Bright Divinity School. I'm going to bring this around here real quick. Dr. Glenn Rout was an amazing guy. He taught theology, but you would never think of him as being a real academic. He was more like a mixture of Santa Claus and Einstein. I mean, he was just one of these brilliant people that seemed too sweet to be that smart. It's kind of a strange thing. He had this relational quality about him that was, I'm not going to draw pictures, so don't worry about that. He had this relational quality about him that just made you want to come to him to ask questions, to deal with a problem. And he told us a story in seminary class once about one of his former students who had come to visit him after he'd been out for a few years. His life was falling apart. He told this to the class. He said his life was falling apart. He was in the midst of an unexpected divorce. His mother was dying. Everything was going bad. The church was not working. I mean, everything around him was in free fall, essentially. Nothing was going the way it was supposed to. And he looked at Dr. Rout and he said, I'm a man of faith. I mean, I think I'm a spiritual person. He said, I don't know what to do. He said, I now find myself, when I find myself praying, I don't think God's there. And then he looked at Rout and he said, I don't think God has ever been there. What a powerful thing to say. For him to get to that place where suddenly everything seems out of whack and you're falling without a net. You're falling without any of your former beliefs or anything you held on to or any of those rocks you would cling to, like Peter Mayer's song. You're falling. And Glenn Rout said this, but he said it with that kind of Einstein, Santa Claus-like compassion. As he looked at him, Glenn Rout told us, he said, I looked at him and I said, maybe it's not that God isn't here, but that you aren't here. In fact, he said, maybe you haven't been here all along. That's an interesting thing to say. Maybe you haven't been here all along. What would it be like to be in a coffin? What would it like to be in a box that's so insulated, we're really not that present? We're really not that in touch. In fact, as Glenn Rout would tell us, he said, sometimes we don't get in touch with the meaning of life until the meaning of life comes into question. Right? That's what Richard Rohr's saying. That's what Philip Simmons was saying when he said, ask for more tigers. He was saying, sometimes we don't deal with the meaning of life. We don't question it until it itself comes into question. And then at that point, maybe we're not ready for it. Maybe we don't even know how to get out of the muck. Maybe we don't even know how to break out of that coffin, to rise up, to see light where there's darkness. My uncle used to play these tricks. I've told you before, a lot of my uncle's mischievousness. You may know this one, so I'm sorry if you do. But if you don't, this is one of these little sermon illustrations you can take home with you. Do it with your friends. Do it with your grandkids. You've probably done this before, though. You got 9 dots. He did this with me. He did 2 of these things. You got 9 dots, and he said, my uncle would say, now you got to connect all these dots with 4 lines. And you can't leave the paper, right? You done this before? Some of you have, some of you haven't? Okay, well, you can remember this. And here I am going like this. He has 4 straight lines, and you can't leave the paper, and you connect all 9 dots. And I'm going, oh, okay, and I'm going all over the place. I'm going like this. He said, did you hear what I said about straight line? And then I said, okay, so then I tried a straight line like this, and then I missed these 2 dots, connecting them with 4 lines. And then he smiled at me, and he did this. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I said, isn't that cheating? And he said, no, I didn't tell you couldn't go out of the box. And sometimes to deal with the problem, you got to get out of the box, right? He did this other one, which is also one of my favorites. He didn't do this on paper. He did this on the sand. He did this out when we were hiking once. He drew a line. He just passing time. He said, Tommy, you see this line? I said, yeah. He said, and he drew it in the sand. He said, I want you to change this line. I want you to make it smaller. And I said, well, that's easy. And I went out in the sand, and I was about to touch it and erase it. He says, no, you can't touch the line. And so I bent down. I was going to blow it. No, you can't manipulate the line in any way. And I said, well, then how am I supposed to change it if I can't do anything to it? And so he took his foot and he did this. And he drew a longer line right next to it. That line is shorter than that line. Now you're going like, oh, that's just a silly trick. And I said, well, no, it is a silly little trick, but it also is a complicated thing. We have a tough time getting out of the boxes. We had a tough time seeing beyond the forest, the trees, the forest beyond the trees. We have a tough time dealing with feeling trapped or feeling when we're falling out of when we're falling freely. It's hard to get out of that perspective. But what these things remind us is that sometimes the only way to get out of your perspective is to get out of that box. And it's hard. How do we do it? Paul, I think, says something very simple. And I think it's a part of who we are. It's been a part of how we approach things in here for many, many years. Paul says, what do? You do like God. He says, look at what God does and do what God does. Well, what does God do? God loves. So he says, do what God does, love. Now, here's where it's going to get hard for you. Because it's not saying, love your neighbor. It's saying, be like God. That's what I'm saying. That's what I see it saying. When we find ourselves buried, do what God does. Be like God. I read a GQ magazine article the other day. Are you laughing because you're looking at me going like, you do not read GQ magazine? I don't. A friend put the link up to me, gave me the link. I don't read GQ magazine. That's pretty obvious. I wear the same jeans and the same shirt pretty much every day. But I read this article because it was about one of my favorite heroes, one of my people I look up to, Stephen Colbert. And the reason why I look up to him is not because he's controversial, it's because he's clever. And not just because he's clever, it's because he comes out of a tradition. He's a deeply faithful Catholic and a Christian, and yet he approaches it from an unusual perspective because of that cleverness. So when it was an article about why he is the way that he is and how he got to where he was, I wanted to read this. And what was interesting in the article was that Stephen Colbert said, the interviewer said, so what one thing has really changed your life, has really helped you get where you are? And he said, it's going to sound strange, but it was the tragic death of my father and my 2 older brothers in an airline accident when I was 10. It left my mother and me all alone. The interviewer said, that tragedy is what helped you get to where you are. That doesn't make any sense. And Stephen Colbert said, it doesn't. But that's what it was. He said, when I think of what happened to me then, I pretty much lived the next number of years. We moved in the city, and I pretty much just lived. I didn't take any interest in my studies. I didn't do anything with my life. I pretty much just roamed around in a stupor, if you look back at it, he said. But then he said in college, I just took some acting classes and philosophy classes because I figured maybe I'll get some answers, and then maybe I can just have some fun and won't have to think too hard. So he took the acting classes, and he said, this is what he said. He said, and that's where I think I learned the greatest lesson of all. From the college classes I took to my great mentors at Second City Improv, where he eventually ended up studying, the lesson is simply this. You have to learn to love the bomb. Now, improvisers know what I mean by that, know what he means. You have to learn to love the bomb. You have to learn to love the failures. You have to learn to love the mistakes, the pain, even the suffering and the fear. You have to learn to love that. If you don't learn to love the bomb continues to dominate you, even if you think you've avoided it and moved on. It's not the same as saying simply shake it off and get back in the game, and it's not saying it's no big deal, and it's also not saying I have to like it, he said, because I don't like it, and I wish that it had never happened. But it was only when I learned to love it, when I learned to see what it was. And he said, love is not a value, love is a verb. He said, it's realizing that that pain is now a part of my life. That embarrassment, when I fell on the stage, face forward, that pain that I experienced in my life when my father died, that's part of a bigger picture. And he said, that bigger picture, the only way I can connect to it, and he said, I call it God, but you can call it life, you can call it mystery, you can call it breath, you can call it whatever you want, but there's something bigger. And when you realize that you're a part of that bigger picture, in the midst of that, you learn to love the bomb and to get creative with it, and then it teaches you. I think that's what Paul's talking about. That's what I see when we're in the midst of the muck. What do? We're in the midst of chaos. We do what God does. We learn to love. What was it that Joseph Campbell said when he was being interviewed by Bill Moyers? Bill Moyers said, so what do the sacred stories teach us about how to deal with suffering? And Joseph Campbell said, we are part of a bigger picture. And where we stumble and fall, that's where we find the gold. But you got to realize you're part of a bigger picture. Whatever's happening right now is part of a bigger picture. And the only way to deal with it is not to run with it, or not to hide in fear, or not to cling to rocks, but to let go, to love it, to get creative with it, to find ways to engage. So what does it mean to love like God? What did God do in the midst of chaos? God got creative. What did God do in the midst of darkness? God opened up, and there was light in the middle of it. Sometimes when we get in that box, the only way to deal with it is to find a way out, to step outside of it and look back. Give ourselves permission to just step outside of it. Maybe that means going to somebody and asking somebody about it. Do I have the right perspective on what's happening? Am I seeing this whole picture? But the one thing it doesn't mean is to go in. It doesn't mean to hide. It doesn't mean to run for cover, because that's just getting deeper into the coffin. We have to allow ourselves to be with it and to live with it, and even to try to engage it creatively. And here's what I think happens. That when we learn to love the bomb, that there's this blessed irony that the band, y'all can come on up because I want you to be ready to sing this. That there's this blessed irony that happens when we learn to love the bomb. Because I know that typically the response of so many of our Christian friends, for example, or some that we know of or that we might read of. And again, I'm gonna push you a little bit on this. Our tendency is to want to pray out there and to say, God, fix this, and where's my net? That's not what Paul's saying. Paul's saying in the midst of the darkness, you have to love. You have to get creative with it. You have to love the bomb. And what happens, the irony is that when we stop looking for the net and we stop focusing on why things are happening or why we're screwing up, when we risk loving the bomb, when we risk loving ourselves into the bigger picture, that's when nets somehow start to appear. And we start to experience free falling.